The wheel of suffering is a core concept in Buddhism. It's less of a religious belief and more of a philosophical way of describing how our attachments and desires fuel a kind of existential unhappiness, trapping us in an endless loop of always wanting what we don't have. The endless craving for more drives a kind of insanity, chasing after a satisfaction that we can never actually achieve. Here in the West, we have more sophisticated terminology for it. We call it the North American dream. That never-ending treadmill that keeps us running harder and faster, believing we're inching ever closer to the life we truly desire, but never actually arriving. This endless craving for more drives everything we do, from our work and relationships to our spending habits, our intellectual pursuits, even our faith. Well, this month, in a series we're calling Rest and Recreation, we're asking the question, what would it look like to step off that treadmill and step instead into the life that God has for us? We began 2 weeks ago by examining Jesus' invitation to bring our tired and weary selves to him and recover our souls by aligning our lives with his, learning from Jesus the unforced rhythms of grace. Rhythms that have their roots in an ancient biblical practice called Sabbath, an idea so core to God's design for life, it is woven into the very fabric of reality, embedded in the cadence of the cosmos, a 7-day rhythm that has its culmination in a full day of rest and recreation. And this rhythm begins, as we learned last week, with the radical idea of stopping, of powering down, finding the off switch, engaging in intentional inactivity. Now, while the primordial seeds of Sabbath keeping are sown in the very first page of the Bible with God resting on the seventh day of creation, the actual weekly practice of Sabbath keeping isn't commanded until much later. In Exodus chapter 20, as part of the Ten Commandments, God instructs Israel to remember the Sabbath, implying that Sabbath was already enough of a thing in the air that God simply had to remind them to remember it. Now, you may recall that while God was giving Moses the Ten Commandments at the top of Mount Sinai, Israel was breaking most of them down at the bottom, famously by worshiping the statue of a golden calf. As a consequence, God forced Israel to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. Actually, Deuteronomy 2:14 says that it was technically 38 years, but who's counting? It was long enough for that entire generation to die out, at which point Moses repeats the Ten Commandments to a new generation of Israelites. In the book of Deuteronomy, a book that literally its name means second law or repeated law, this newly remastered and re-released Ten Commandments list is virtually identical to the original, with one exception, the fourth commandment, the one about Sabbath keeping, which gets 3 significant edits that we're going to look at today. If you look at the 2 commandments side by side, you will immediately notice the first edit. Take a look here. In Exodus, the Israelites are told to remember the Sabbath, but here in Deuteronomy, Moses tells them to observe it. Now, this might seem like a pretty minor change, but consider this. It's one thing for me to remember my wife's birthday. It's another thing to observe it. It's one thing to be able to remember all the rules of the road, but it's another thing to actually observe them. Moses is calling a new generation of Israelites, of God's people, to not just awareness, but to action, to not just remember the Sabbath, but to actually put it into practice, to put it in the calendar and commit to it, to do it. Now, there's actually a bit of wordplay going on here. The word observe in the original Hebrew is the word shamar, which means to be put in charge of, to diligently keep, to maintain or cultivate. It means to stand guard, to protect, preserve, and pay attention. Far from being a passive verb, shamar implies important, meaningful work. In fact, shamar is one of the 2 words used at the beginning of Genesis in God's original job description for humanity. In Genesis 2:15, we're told that God put the human in the garden to abad and shamar it, to work and take care of it. Now, there's actually an even deeper wordplay going on here, because the word put in that sentence, as in God put humans in the garden, is the word nuach, which means rest. So God rested humanity in the garden to work it. Rested to work. Now, it may come as a surprise to some of us that God actually created us from the beginning to work. That work is part of God's original design for life and part of the Eden blessing. It's probably because for most of us, we're far more familiar with the other kind of work found in the Eden story, the kind associated with the Eden curse. As sin wiggles its way into the story, God says that from now on, through painful toil, you will eat food from the ground all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, and by the sweat of your brow, you will eat your food until you return to the ground. These are the two kinds of work found in the Eden story: the sacred, restful kind of work and the painful sweat of your brow toil. The first is easy and light. It's life-giving, unforced collaboration with creation. The second is hard labor, going against the grain of creation, work that is never finished, that leaves us weary and tired. The weekly practice of Sabbath is God's way of giving us regular rest from that sweat of your brow work, of regularly disconnecting us from the wheel of suffering. But it's actually more than that. It's about an invitation to restfulness in all our work, practicing intentional inactivity one day a week so that all our activity on the other 6 days flows out of a deep connection to God and sacred partnership with the Spirit. This is precisely what Jesus was demonstrating when he supposedly broke the Sabbath. In a story in the Gospel of John, chapter 5, Jesus heals a man who had been unable to walk for, John curiously adds, 38 years. 38 years. Alarm bells should be dinging in our minds here. Remember Deuteronomy? This guy's entire life had been a reenactment of Israel's wilderness wanderings, only he wasn't even able to wander. He was stuck in permanent rest mode. Now, because this miraculous healing had taken place on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders tried to use this as an opportunity to discredit Jesus. You see, even though the Torah, the Old Testament laws governing Sabbath, don't say anything forbidding healing on the Sabbath, well, their traditions and customs did suggest that Jesus was, in fact, working on the Sabbath. But to them, Jesus replies saying, you know what? My Father is always at work to this very day, and I too am working. Truly, I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees the Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. You see, to Jesus, the Sabbath isn't some surface level set of rules meant to be observed on one certain day of the week. It's about something so much deeper, about resting in the activity of God. Whatever Jesus observed his heavenly Father doing, he just sort of seamlessly joined in, revealing that Sabbath isn't about what you do or don't do on a certain day. It is about cultivating a deep connection to our heavenly Father, about becoming conduits of the Spirit's work in and through us, about learning to live connected to Jesus so that all of our work is an outflow of what the Spirit of God is already doing within us. See, observing the Sabbath is about learning to observe the Spirit's work in and among and all around us, so that not just our work, but our lives can increasingly be lived not by the sweat of our brow, but in sacred union with our Maker, with the Creator of the cosmos, lived in alignment with the grain of creation, always serving, but never slaving. Now, if you're anything like me, this kind of restfulness is hard work. I mean, it's more than just taking a day off, crashing on the couch, scrolling and streaming, or maybe even catching a quick nap. True Sabbath rest is about more than just stopping or sleeping. In her book, Sacred Rest, board-certified doctor of internal medicine, author, and Jesus follower, Dr. Sandra Dalton Smith, identifies 7 different types of rest that we all need. She writes about physical, mental, emotional, sensory, creative, social, and spiritual rest. I mean, this means that true restfulness can look like a relaxing hike or the reading of a good book or listening to uplifting music, powering down our devices, or journaling to untangle our anxious thoughts, grabbing a cup of tea with a good friend, or spending time in quiet, prayerful contemplation. The point is, rest is intensely personal. What restores your soul is very likely different than what somebody else will find restful. The goal is to find what nourishes you, what replenishes your deep energy reserves, so that you can increasingly not only rest from your work, but experience restfulness in your work. And because this kind of restfulness just doesn't come naturally to most of us, we can't just leave it up to whenever we happen to remember to rest. We need to plan it and work at it. We need intentionality to actually practice and observe it. Well, this leads us to the second and most significant edit to the original Sabbath command, which has to do with the reason why we Sabbath. In the original Sabbath, the idea of Sabbath was linked to the story of Eden, to God resting on the seventh day of creation. But here in Deuteronomy, Moses links it to the story of the Exodus. Take a look. As you can see, the two commands are completely different. You see, to a new generation of God's people who are about to step into the promised land, a land that God will provide them without ever them having to work for it or earn it, to live in houses they didn't build and enjoy the fruit of vineyards they didn't plant. Moses begins by reminding them of their history as slaves, as a people bred in captivity, in harsh conditions and forced labor. To get a sense of what it was like, Exodus chapter 1 tells us that they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread. So the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites, and they worked them ruthlessly. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar, with all kinds of work in the fields. And all the harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. I mean, talk about the wheel of suffering. An endless loop of sweat of your brow, painful toil. And did you notice what all of that work was for? Store cities. Basically, warehouse cities to store all of Pharaoh's extra stuff. As Moses, on behalf of God, urges Pharaoh to let the people go, to release them and liberate them from their harsh labor. Listen to Pharaoh's response in Exodus chapter 5. He says to Moses, "Why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work." And then Pharaoh said, "Look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you are stopping them from working." So that same day, Pharaoh gave the order to the slave drivers and overseers in charge of the people, "You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They are lazy. That is why they are crying out, 'Let us go sacrifice to our God.' Make them work harder for the people so that they may keep working. Lazy. That's what you are. Lazy. Now get to work." You ever worked for that boss? Have you ever been that boss? All work and no play? Working straight through your breaks and seeing days off as lazy, always pushing harder, faster for more, but never achieving enough, never doing enough, never earning or making or selling enough, never ever being enough, never enough. And it's not just the slave-driving CEOs or Pharaoh-like bosses who are our oppressive overlords. It's that spirit of Pharaoh in all of us, that little voice that tells us, you are what you do. That your productivity and performance, that your paycheck and possessions define you. That no matter how much success you have, it's never quite enough. No matter how much work you get done, you're never quite finished. I mean, you could be happy, but only after that next pay increase or promotion, only after your business goes to the next level. And it's all a lie, the North American fantasy. Because the more we achieve and acquire, the more our appetites grow and the more dissatisfied we feel. This is the wheel of suffering. And this is the rationale given, the new reason for celebrating Sabbath as a way to push back against our endless cravings and attachments, to step off the treadmill of always producing and consuming, but never doing or having enough, never being enough. Sabbath says enough is enough. It draws a weekly line in the sand and says this far and no further. John Mark Comer, in his online course on Sabbath, says that Sabbath is an act of resistance. It is resistance against the way the world works, against being slaves to our work, whatever form our work takes. You know, whether you're a full-time student, a part-time volunteer, a retired mall walker, a stay-at-home parent, or a Fortune 500 CEO. You know, if there are 7 types of rest, well, Jewish tradition says there are actually 39 types of work. You know, I was thinking about this. 39 is a significant number in the ancient Jewish culture. It was the number of lashings you could give somebody for breaking the law. I mean, it was actually 40, but they thought that 40 was the number that would kill you, and so they said 40 minus 1 was enough to bring you to the brink of death, but not push you over. The Apostle Paul got 39 lashings 5 times, he says, not for breaking the law, but for honoring Jesus. And I wonder if there isn't a parallel between that idea and the 39 forms of work, enough to bring us to the brink of death, but not push us over, just keeping us alive long enough to do more work. These 39 forms of work include things like baking bread or cleaning our house, plowing a field, or I guess cutting your grass, or even tying a knot, which I'm sure is not a euphemism for the hard labor of marriage. All 39 forms of work were prohibited on the Sabbath. And before you think maybe that's a little excessive, know that there is purpose to all the prohibitions. You see, in the Bible's do's and don'ts, the do commands are far more restrictive, limiting you to only very prescribed behavior, like do the dishes, do your homework, do the laundry. But the don't commandments, despite sounding kind of negative, are actually far more flexible. I'll give you an example. Like if I were to tell you that on my Sabbath, I pretty much adhere to 3 don'ts. Don't work, which means, no emails, errands, or chores, no yard work, no housework. Don't go on screens, no phone, TV, or computer. And don't spend or make money. So don't go shopping or go to a restaurant or take a gig. Those are 3 significant don'ts that govern my Sabbath, but they actually still leave a ton of room for all kinds of life-giving work or life-giving activity. The don'ts actually just protect my day from slipping into all kinds of non-life-giving activity. And the point here isn't to get all legalistic about how we keep our Sabbath. It's just about identifying what helps me rest well and then eliminating the things that keep me restless. It's not about adding all kinds of extra requirements to our already busy lives. It's about reducing and removing the already existing constant demands on us, safeguarding our day against slipping back into work mode. Now, as you consider what it would be like to set aside time for Sabbath in your weekly rhythm, maybe start by brainstorming what are the things that would govern your Sabbath. You can start by trying to make like a to-don't list as a way of personalizing, tailoring your Sabbath to your unique God-given personality and wiring, as a way of creating a Sabbath by you and for you, or kind of. This actually brings us to the 3rd edit to the Sabbath command in Deuteronomy. But before we get there, speaking of downtime, when I was a kid, I used to love watching reruns of the show Gilligan's Island. Now, if you've never seen the show or maybe never even heard of it, just sit right back and you'll hear a tale of a fateful trip that started from a tropic port aboard a tiny ship. Now, the first mate was a mighty sailing man, and the skipper brave and sure. And together with 5 passengers, they set sail that day for a 3-hour tour. A 3-hour tour. But that's not what happened, is it? As the theme song continues, we learn that the weather started getting rough. The tiny ship was tossed, run aground on an uncharted desert island, stranding the show's 7 characters. There was Gilligan, of course, the skipper too, the millionaire and his wife, the movie star, and the rest. And the rest. At least that's how the theme song went in 1964 when the show first aired. The rest referred to 2 B-level actors who were considered supporting cast at the time, but by the second season, Bob Denver, who was the actor who played Gilligan, insisted that all 7 characters share top billing. And so the theme song was rewritten, and the phrase, "and the rest," was replaced with "the Professor and Marianne." This is actually almost exactly what happens at the end of the Sabbath commandment in Deuteronomy. Take a look. What you'll see here is that the instruction about "and your animals" gets changed or added to refer to "and your oxen and donkey," the Professor and Marianne of the 10 Commandments. Now, why these 2 animals are named specifically, on the surface, it's pretty obvious. These are the 2 primary beasts of burden in the ancient world, animals associated with work. But it's deeper than that. You see, oxen were religiously clean animals, while donkeys were religiously unclean. Your oxen was the kind of thing you offered as a sacred worship offering to God, while donkeys were seen as worthless even for food, only good for the work they did. But it's even deeper than that. You see, as clean and unclean animals, oxen and donkey became symbols of the Israelites and the Gentiles, God's chosen people, and the rest. Naming the oxen and donkey together here is God's way of saying that the gift of Sabbath rest isn't just for insiders, but for outsiders too. It is for everyone to enjoy the same rest as you do. This is about equality. It was a total flattening of the social structure for an entire day every week so that foreigners and citizens, slaves and free, men and women, humans and animals all rested together equally and fully. No hierarchy, no exceptions. This means Sabbath is not just a perk for the wealthy who can afford a day off. It is a weekly holiday regardless of your pay grade. It was a weekly holy day regardless of your religious affiliation. Meaning that person who works for you for at least one day a week doesn't. And that person you think you own, well, the Sabbath is a reminder that you don't. In our context, it might mean that getting an extra day off by making your employees work overtime, it isn't Sabbath. Going out for a nice night out that requires restaurant and theater staff bust their butts for minimum wage, it's not a bad thing to do, but it's not Sabbath. That all-inclusive resort where you get pampered and get all of that luxurious restfulness at the expense of locals who put in long hours and wait on you hand and foot, that's not Sabbath. Sabbath, true Sabbath, is liberation theology lived out, proclaimed and practiced through a 1 day out of 7 universal, everyone in the pool invitation to rest. Sabbath is rest from our work, restfulness in our work, in a way that works for the rest. Sabbath is more than just a day off. It is shamar. It is important and meaningful work that can't be left up to haphazard attempts at remembering it. It requires intentionality, planning, effort, and a commitment to actually practice and observe it. Sabbath is an active resistance against the North American nightmare that enslaves us to our work, against the wheel of suffering and the endless craving for more. It is a weekly reminder that we don't work for Pharaoh. We work as unto the Lord, who sees us as human beings, not human doings, created in the image of the God who self-identifies as I am, not I do. And true Sabbath recognizes and honors that image of God in everyone. It is a commitment to a regular practice of Eden-like equality. One day, lived in anticipation of the one day when we will all be invited and welcomed into an eternal Sabbath rest. As the band comes to lead us in a time of response, I want to invite you to take a moment and imagine with me what it would be like to actually be a community like this of deeply well-rested people who, when asked how we're doing, don't have to choose between answering busy or tired, but can honestly say that we are fully replenished and refreshed, fully restored at a soul level, because we're living in sync with the Spirit and experiencing rest from our work and restfulness in our work, and inviting all kinds of folks to join us in that rest. Because I'm increasingly beginning to wonder if this kind of Sabbath rest, this kind of physical, mental, emotional, sensory, creative, social, and spiritual rest might not be the greatest gift, the most significant and profound thing we have to offer a world of restless souls chasing after a kind of satisfaction they will never achieve. The end of our endless cravings, a mass exodus from the wheel of suffering, true sacred rest. But in order for us to be able to give that gift to others, we first need to be able to live it ourselves. And as a step in that direction, we're going to conclude here with another practice of Selah, like we did earlier this morning. And as we take this moment to rest, I simply pray that the God of Sabbath will bring you peace, and that our restless souls will find rest in Jesus.